Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Whether you're joining me live or you're watching the recording, I appreciate you watching. This week, we're going for something just a little bit easier, right? Last week, really the last couple of weeks, we were looking at Python. Python was a little bit of a challenge. So that's why I thought I'd be a little sneaky and try to help you all with some answers to the lab last week in our live class. So we'll see who all actually watches these live classes as I grade the lab assignments this week. See who watches them all the way through at least. But this week we're moving on to HTML, and we're going to be working on HTML and different front-end web languages over the course of the next several weeks, right? So the labs in modules 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 all tie together, right? So you'll be working on one site that all ties together with the same labs for modules 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. You'll just be adding a little bit more to it each week, just a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. Until when we get to the end, you have kind of a finished site with everything that you need on it that kind of exhibits all of the different features of our front-end web languages that we talked about. And, just as kind of a reminder, we go back to the idea of front-end versus back-end web languages. We talked about that when we talked in Module 2, the idea of front-end versus back-end. Right? We said front-end included things like HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And these are things that are interpreted by our browsers. Our servers send our browsers these files. Our browsers interpret these files, and that's what shows our websites on our screen. Our back-end languages, things like PHP, which we'll be talking about in Module 10, require an additional layer of interpretation by the server before it sends the files that are interpreted by the server to the end user for them to be able to see their site. And so we've got a lot to cover today, and I'm going to try to cover a bunch within the course of the next hour. And we're going to start out by talking about the HTML skeleton, the foundation of the website. I call it the HTML skeleton because it's basically the bare bones of what you need to be able to build a website. And for the first part of this, I'm going to do a lot of talking, but I'm not going to do a lot of demonstration. We're going to do some more demonstration when we get sort of into the second half of our live class today. But you'll see why we're not going to do as much demonstration when we get to that point. Right? So we're talking about building websites, and we're talking about HTML specifically. And this is something that some of you might have a little bit more experience with. Right, I know that there are a lot of business classes and different classes, in the local high schools that will allow you to make a basic website. And in general, from what I have seen of some of the techniques that they use in some of these classes, they're a bit older in some of their techniques that they utilize. Right, like, one of the students in the seated class said, "Oh yeah, we made a website in high school. We had to use marquee." And we won't even talk about a marquee tag in this course or in any of my courses, because the marquee tag is not a tag that is utilized in 2022. Although it was one that was kind of heavily utilized in the late 90s and early 2000s. To kind of grab people's attention. It's not one that's really utilized any longer. So just what exactly is HTML? Let's start out by talking about just what HTML is. And when we're talking about HTML, HTML is not technically a programming language. right? That's what kind of the ML stands for there. ML stands for markup language, right? It's HTML, Hypertext Markup Language, right? And this is where, again, we're tying a lot of the stuff that we learned in modules 1 and 2 into the things that we're learning now, right? Even things that we learned in modules 3 and 4, we're still tying it into things that we're learning now, right? Because we said that programming languages, they all have these 5 things that they can do, right? They can have input, output, repetition, conditionals, and they can do math. But HTML, it can't do those 5 things. Right? And those 5 things, among a couple other things, are what makes a programming language Turing complete. Some of you did your research papers for Module 1 on Alan Turing, and that's where the name Turing complete comes from. Right, when Turing was theorizing the idea of, modern programming languages in the, 1940s, 1950s. Right, 10 to 15 years before, they would really become a thing. These were the things that he was postulating that programming languages would require, they'd need to be able to take an input, they would need to be able to give an output, they would need to be able to do things in a repeated fashion, that they would need to be able to make decisions, that they would need to be able to do math, right? HTML doesn't do that. HTML is a markup language. And we'll talk more about what it means for something to be a markup language, kind of as we progress throughout our class today. But that means that HTML is not a programming language, which in and of itself is good news for us, because it means that HTML is a lot friendlier to us than a programming language would be, right? We got a little bit of practice in Python over the course of the last couple of weeks. And one of the things that we noticed as we were practicing Python is that the way that we spelled our words, where we put our uppercase letters, where we put our lowercase letters, where we put our tabs and our different spaces, they had a lot of meaning when we were dealing with our programming language. But since now we're dealing with HTML, and HTML is not a programming language, it's a markup language, well, all that stuff's not as important anymore, right? When we are writing our tags, which is something that we'll be looking at, we don't really have to worry about whether our tags are all uppercase, all lowercase, or a mixture. We don't have to worry about whether we put in extra spaces or not in between HTML lines. Right, it's a lot friendlier to us. It gives us some more flexibility, and it's a bit easier because of that, right? And so HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. The H in hyper, the T in text, the M in markup, the L in language make up our initialism, HTML. And the idea of hypertext here, you might remember that from Module 2, right, when we were talking about HTTP, our Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So our Hypertext Transfer Protocol is transferring across its protocol this hypertext markup language. And so this hypertext markup language is really forming the structure of our websites. Right? One of the things that we talk about a lot when we talk about HTML is we talk about it in terms of blueprints, right? And we say that we're kind of building a house and we're forming a structure. We can kind of look at this as the walls and the doors and the basic structure of our website. But when we're using just HTML by itself, one of the things that we'll notice is that our website looks pretty ugly, right? Like it's just kind of plain black and white, just a singular font type, no color, just kind of boring and ugly. But as we progress and as we add things to it and as we do more with it, we can start to add a little bit of life to it. When we get to CSS, we can start to add some decorations in there. We can start to paint the walls and add some pillows and furniture and different decorations. And then when we get to JavaScript, we can start making things interactive, making things move around, putting things on wheels and making things move around and grow and shrink and all this kind of fun stuff, and having a real great time with everything that's on our page. And so we're starting out by looking at our HTML skeleton, and our HTML skeleton has 4 basic parts. 4 basic parts, and these 4 basic parts are the doctype, the HTML tags, the head tags, and the body tags. And when we're talking about tags here, these tags are giving us a structure, and they're something that we want to pay attention to now as we're just kind of getting started with these tags, because the pattern that these tags create for us is a pattern that will continue as we progress through working with HTML. Right, so our HTML skeleton, these are our bare bones of creating our website, and they have 4 basic parts: our doctype, our HTML tags, our head tags, and our body tags. And the first one that I want us to look at is our doctype. And the doctype isn't necessarily an HTML tag. Right, we can kind of think about the doctype like we thought about that shebang when we were dealing with our Python. Right, if you remember back to the last couple of weeks, we were dealing with our shebang in Python, and we put this line of code at the top of our program, and that was a message to our computer that if we were to double click and run this program, it's a Python program, specifically a Python 3 program. So if we have a Python 3 environment installed on our computers, well, we should just go ahead and run it, because that's what kind of program this is. And so our doctype here operates very similarly. Our doctype declaration has to be the very first thing at the very tip top of our HTML document, before the opening HTML tag. And what this doctype declaration does is it's not an HTML tag, but it's an instruction to our web browser about what version of HTML the page is written in. And the doctype declaration is not case sensitive. So just like when we were dealing with our shebang in Python, we were saying, if we're basically saying, this program's written in Python 3. So if you have a Python 3 environment on this computer, you can, just run this program in it and it'll work. We're telling our browser, this is a page that's written in HTML. And our doctype used to be an even bigger deal than it is now, right? HTML5 ushered in a new age of the doctype, which made our lives a whole lot easier. Right, but before HTML5, right back about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we had HTML4. And HTML4 made things a lot more difficult. And I'm only going to talk about HTML4 here just as sort of a legacy system, right? Just in case some of you, decide to be web developers one day and you go out and you get a job in web development and you get on a website that you've been asked to work on and edit and change. And you see this weird doctype at the top of it, and just so you kind of know what it is. Right, so our old doctype declaration was an HTML 4.01 doctype declaration. And it referred to a DTD standard. All right, or a doctype declaration standard. And it was actually based on a standardized generalization markup language, which was an official ISO standard, ISO 8879. ISO 8879. And for those of you who are like retraining, and maybe, you worked in a factory or you worked in, some sort of machining environment, for a part of your adult life, you might be familiar with ISO standards. ISO standards. ISO stands for the International Standardization Organization. They develop standards for all sorts of industries, right? And in this instance, one of them was web development. But we don't worry about this anymore. We do not worry about this anymore. But back in the day when we worried about this, our Doctype declarations looked a little bit like this, right? So I show you this now, so you know what we're dealing with. Now you can kind of ignore this line here, this first line. This first line here you can ignore. This is a comment in HTML. When you see less than, exclamation point, dash, dash, and then on the other side of it, dash, dash, greater than, that is a comment. And just like when we did comments in Python, that tells our computer to ignore that statement. So all we're doing here is we're telling our browser to ignore this statement. This is just a label for this bit of code. So we can ignore that statement there. So the line of code that we have underneath that here is the Doctype Declaration. And we can see, this is the HTML 4.01 Doctype Declaration for a strict Doctype declaration. And I just want you to see this so you can understand how the Doctype Declaration has changed. Right? Because when we got our HTML5 Doctype Declaration, one of the first things that we said was, well, we don't need these ISO standards. Right? We've got Tim Berners-Lee, we've got the W3C, many of you, you wrote about Tim Berners-Lee and the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, in your research papers. And you said, this organization, this is our governing body who's deciding our standards for our Doctype declaration. So we don't really need to have any other governing body determining our standards. We can determine them ourselves. So as we created a new standard, we said, hey, you know what? We can take our standard, we can simplify it, make it a whole lot easier. So we went from this big, long statement to our HTML5 Doctype. Right, which is simply just, remember again, this first part here, that is just the comment. So that's what's below it. Less than, exclamation point, Doctype, HTML, greater than. That is our HTML5 Doctype. And so that tells our browser that this is a modern HTML-based website. Right, so again, HTML5, we decided, hey, we don't need these ISO standard generalized, SGML markup language compliant nonsense, right? We've got our own standards governing body, the W3C. I mean, they even built the Doctype Declaration previously. They were just handing it off to some other governing body to certify it. So we don't really need to bother with that. So now we can just do things ourselves. We don't need all that other stuff. And we can just signify it. And so that gives us our Doctype declaration. So we put this line of code, this one singular line of code, which is the green line here yet again. in every single HTML page that we build. That's our first piece of our skeleton. From there, the next thing that we add is we add our HTML tag, or more precisely, our HTML tags. Right? You know, we talk about it as a plural because for the vast majority of tags, especially the ones that we will be talking about for this course, you have two tags. You have an opening tag and you have a closing tag. And so the HTML tag represents the browser that what is written in between these two tags is HTML. Right, so we have our doctype at the top that says this is an HTML document. Then inside our HTML document, we have HTML tags, where we have an opening HTML tag at the top that says this is where our HTML begins. And then all the way at the bottom, we have a closing HTML tag, which is to denote to our browser, basically, this is where our HTML ends. And another big thing here is that the HTML tag represents the root of an HTML document. It is the oldest ancestor of an HTML document. One of the things that we talk about a lot in web development is the idea of the DOM, and that's one of the things that I talk about, or that's one of the ideas that I introduce on the next slide. But the idea that this is the root of this starts to get us moving with that. So all of the other tags that we put into our page, with the exception of that doctype tag that we just discussed, will go in between the opening and closing HTML tags. Every single other tag we write will go in between the opening and the closing HTML tag, because it's all HTML, right? Our HTML tags basically state that this is HTML that's inside of here. So our general rule, again, is that most, but not all, of our tags come in pairs, right? So we have an opening tag, something that we would see written such as greater than HTML. And then at some point on our page, it would have an accompanying closing HTML. And the closing tag in a pair of HTML tags, whether it's specifically HTML tags or any other of our markup language tags that we use in HTML, it has a / after the less than symbol. That's what makes it distinct from the opening tag. So this is our open over here. And then this would be our close. And that creates a container. Everything else can go in between. So I'm starting to create this structure. Right, one of these sort of through lines of the entire course is the idea of creating structures and nested containers. Right, you know, one of the things that we kind of looked at when we were talking about Python is that, you know, we can put a conditional inside of another conditional, or we can put a conditional inside of a loop, or we can, you know, put a variable inside of this other thing, right? And so we can take a container and nest it inside of another container, and we can create a structure. You know, we saw the same thing sort of happening when we were examining our block logic a couple of weeks ago. Right? When we were actually using those visual puzzle pieces and putting one puzzle piece inside of another piece, we actually saw the physical structure of these different puzzle pieces going inside of one another. And so as we're programming and as we're writing code, organization and structure becomes incredibly important. And in HTML specifically, this container system, this organization and structure, kind of gives us what we call the DOM, or document object model. So the root of our document, as we've already mentioned, the document itself is just our HTML page, right? And this is something that is basically important forever. So if you continue in the programming and web development program here, the idea of the DOM never stops being important, right? I talk about the DOM in like 5 different classes in the degree program, right? Because basically when we're thinking about the DOM, we're thinking about essentially a family tree, right? Based on this nested tree structure, right? We could sort of even look at it like that, right? Because one of the things that we'll see as we progress, it's like, okay, well, we'll create some HTML tags. Inside of that, we'll put a head tag. We'll close our head tag. We'll put a body tag. We might put an H1 tag inside of there. We might put a paragraph inside of there. We close our body tag. We close our HTML tag, right? We've generated a structure here. And this structure is actually a family tree, right? We can kind of take and we can draw out this structure like it's a family tree. And so at the root of our family tree, at the very top of our family tree, well, it's our HTML tag. And then when we look and see, well, what's directly nested inside of our tag, well, we have this head and this body. That's directly inside of the HTML without being inside of something else. Right, so we can take and we can just kind of draw some lines going down from our HTML. And we can say, okay, well, we have a head. And we have a body. Well, now inside of this body, right, if we look at the body, between the opening body tag and the closing body tag, we have an H1 and we have a paragraph. Well, let's break that out. We have an H1. And we have a paragraph. And this is essentially how our DOM works. It creates this sort of structure on the back end so we can kind of address things in a different way. We can look at these relationships in a different sort of way. And we can work with these elements in a different sort of way. Right? So when we're talking about these relationships, we actually in the discipline, we talk about them in familial sort of relationships, right? We talk about them like they're a part of a family tree. We say that, oh, this paragraph here, that is a child of this body and a grandchild of the HTML. And oh, the paragraph has a parent of the body and a grandparent of the HTML. And it has a sibling of this H1. Right? This is the language that we use to describe these things. So this structure becomes super important. So we're just kind of scraping the surface of it right now, especially when we get into in the advanced class that some of you will take in a year's time. When we get into the advanced class, when we get deep into JavaScript and we're looking at traversing the DOM and addressing specific items in the DOM and manipulating things and adding and removing things from the DOM using JavaScript, these relationships become exceptionally important. And so when we add our HTML tags to our site, right, remember, we're ignoring the lines here. We're ignoring the lines here with the exclamation points in them. Those are just comments, right? The important lines are our doctype line and our opening and closing HTML lines here. These are our important lines. So we can see our HTML tag with our accompanying closing HTML tag. Note the /. The next tag is the head tag. The head element is a container for all of the head elements. Now that sounds kind of redundant, right? But there's certain things that's kind of displayed, or there's certain things that we put in a head tag, right? And it's typically information that is not displayed on your website. You know, it's primarily metadata files that are linked that your website uses, the title of your site, right? So it's scripts, meta information, and the title. Things that aren't necessarily displayed directly on your page. And that goes in the head. Now, this is where things can start to get tricky, right? Because we do have some conflicting terminology here that we need to make sure that we get sort of separated. Head, the head tag, is the set of tags in my HTML that contains my non-displaying information. But then I have header tags. Header tags are container tags that I can use to create a section of my website, like creating a room in my house. So I can kind of take my website and subdivide it. And then I have a heading tag, which is used to create a text-based heading for a sequence of text. So we have 3 different sets of tags that are wildly different, that do wildly different things that sound kind of similar between head, header, and heading. Right? So this is one of those things that can get kind of tricky. So we want to make sure that we pay extra close attention in cases like this to make sure that we are, using things properly and putting things in the right places. Otherwise, we get things messed up and they don't quite work the way that we want them to. Specifically for the head tag elements that we can put in our site, title. Title is a required head element. And when I say required here, nothing's really required. Right? We said HTML is kind of friendly. Like, I can leave my head out altogether. Right? But if I want it to be W3C compliant code, which we do, then everything that we're kind of discussing here is a requirement. And the title is a requirement. Have you ever noticed, like, when you're on a website, right? If we look at, I'll go ahead and pull up a website here. If we look at the replit here, for example, we see up here in the corner, it says home.replit on the tab. Or if I go to clevelandcc.edu, it says Cleveland Community College here on the tab. That comes from the title tag in the head of the website. And I can actually show you that if we look at the Inspect Element tool here. We can look at the head of the site. And I can zoom into it here. We can find the title here if we just kind of scroll through. There's a lot of stuff here. But you can see all of this stuff in the head of the document is non-displaying content. It's meta information. It is links to scripts. It is links to style sheets. Links to different things. And if we look long enough, we will find the title in here somewhere. I've probably passed it and just missed it. There it is. Title: Cleveland Community College - Start Your Journey. And if we look up here and we hover over, we see that this is Cleveland Community College - Start Your Journey. And if you want to play with this stuff, this is something that I encourage that you do. You can actually play with this stuff in the Inspect Element tool. Since this is all on the browser side, you can actually change this stuff, and it changes it on your browser's end. So when you refresh the site, it actually just goes back to normal. Right, so let me find that title again. There it is. So if I wanted to change this from Start Your Journey to maybe Home of the Yetis, if I go up here to the tab and highlight over it now says Cleveland Community College, Home of the Yetis. Pretty nifty, right? And again, that's just browser side. That's just on your end. When I refresh the page, it goes back to normal. Right? I haven't impacted anything on the site. Right? I'm not hacking here. I'm just manipulating the browser side data a little bit, because that's the way websites are transferred to us. But that's what that title property does. So we want to take advantage of that and use that to make sure we get that little bit of information up there. Which is pretty good. So when we see our head with our title tag in our code, right, we would see it kind of like this. I'm going to kind of remove again. We're ignoring these lines that have the exclamation point dash in them. Because those are just comments. But that's what we end up with there, right? We see our HTML tags, our head tags, an opening and closing head tag, a title tag, our opening and closing title tag, with the title of the website that we want to have up there in that little tab between our opening and our closing title tab, or title tag. That's how we get it up there. Right, which is pretty crucial for us. Now finally, our last element in our HTML skeleton is our body tag. And our body tag is so if our head tag is all of the non-displaying content, then our body tag is all of the displaying content. This is where we'll put all of the text, all of the hyperlinks, all of the images, all of the tables, all of the lists, everything that, the browser renders and shows to the user that's coming to your website. So all of our non-rendering content goes in our head. All of our rendering content goes in our body. Things your user doesn't see goes in the head. Things that your user does see goes in the body. And so again, we just add our head tags in here like so. Right, our head tags and our body tags are siblings. Right, so again, I'll kind of mark out the comments really quickly, just so they don't kind of confuse us, because they aren't required here. And we can look at this in a little bit of a different way, right? Like we can see, okay, here's our doc type here at the top. Right, again, that's telling our browser this is an HTML site. Here's the root of our document. These are our HTML tags. They contain all of our HTML for the site. Then we have both of our siblings here that are our two remaining skeleton tags here. Our head tags, which contain the title, and our body tags, right? We can see that they're siblings because the body tag is not inside of the head tag. the body tag is outside of the head tag while still being inside of the HTML tag. We can see that our title tag is a child of the head tag because it is inside of the head tag, right? We see where the closing head tag is in relation to the title tags. And that's what we're talking about there when we're talking about something being inside versus outside. And so I said we weren't going to do a whole lot of demonstration with that. Now I'll kind of tell you why as we go over to Replit. So we're using Replit for these labs as well. Right, we're basically using Replit for the rest of the course until we get to Module 11, and then we're switching it up just a little bit. Right, so now I'm going to create, and instead of creating a Python Replit this time, I'm going to type in HTML. And you should find one that says HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Like this one here, and that's the one I'm going to select. And by default, you'll see that it gives you a template that has all of your HTML skeleton in it for you. Right? It's got your Doctype HTML here at the top. It's got your opening and closing HTML tags. It's got your opening and closing head tags. It's got your opening and closing body tags. Now, it does have some extra things that you don't need, but it also has some things that you definitely need that you don't want to touch. Let's start off talking about those. You do not want to touch this here on line 13. This script source equals script.js. That's what ties this HTML file to this script.js file. Doesn't mean anything now. But when we get to JavaScript, it means something. So do not remove that line. Do not remove what's on line 8 here, this link href equals style.css. Do not touch that line. Leave that line there. That's what ties this file to style.css here. So when we write our CSS, that's how it knows I can go get my CSS from there. Now what I can remove is I can remove this other script. I can remove that and that comment that goes with that. I can get rid of that. I can get rid of this hello world here. I can get rid of that. I can change my title here, and I probably should change my title so it doesn't just say Replit up in the corner. I can change it to whatever I want it to be. Right, so again, you want to make sure that you keep this line, script source equals script.js, because that ties to that script.js. This line, link href equals style.css. You can keep everything else in the header, right? And it gives you all your HTML skeleton. And you might think, well, that's not realistic, is it? Like in the real world, they don't just give you all your code like that, do they? Well, they actually kind of do. Right, let me show you. Let me pull up VS Code, Visual Studio Code, one of the most popular code editing pieces of software that most developers use. I was using this to do a demonstration yesterday in one of our advanced classes. So I'm going to close this folder here. Close folder. And I'm going to create a new file. Just a plain text file. And it's going to ask me to select a language here. And I'm going to click that and I'm going to select HTML from that drop-down list. So now it knows that I'm coding HTML. And so in code editors like this, or IDEs, integrated development environments. There are things that are typically integrated to make them easier and quicker to code in. And so in this instance, we have something called emit. So I can enter one exclamation point and hit enter, and it gives me my entire HTML skeleton here. Everything that I would need to get started with my HTML skeleton. So it's not unrealistic to actually start out with an HTML skeleton in the same way that we start out with an HTML skeleton here in Replit. So let's do a little bit more here today. I've got some more for us to do. Because now that we have an understanding of our skeleton, we can start to add content to our site. And one of the things that I want to make sure that we don't do is we don't get into bad habits. So I want to make sure that we don't do this the wrong way. And so one of the things that you'll see a lot in examples and things online is the overuse of divs. Div this, div that, div this, div that. And so a div is a container tag. And it basically stands for a division. Right? You're basically subdividing your site. But what a div lacks is something that we call semantics. And all semantics really is meaning. Right? So when we look at a floor plan, we look at something like this. Right? And this gives us our floor plan for a house. And it's our floor plan with our blueprint here for a house. And let's just imagine for a minute that none of these room names, let's just imagine that they're not there. You've got some indication based on what's in these rooms as to what these rooms are, but it's really kind of tough to tell the master bedroom from the living room, from the closet, from the stairs, from various other parts without those labels there, right? And so that's why we want to make sure that we use semantics and semantic elements as we're using this. Right, because semantic elements have meaning. So instead of divs, we'll use things like article, section, footer, header, main. Right, so one of the things I'll put in my site is a header. Right, and the header element represents a container for the introductory or header of a site, right? Like if we look at a site, like you've seen a bunch of sites before, too many browser windows open here. Where is this one? Right, like you see this part up here at the top of a site, that's your header. Right, remember not to be confused with head. This goes into our body of our site. And we would put it here. Now, on its own, that doesn't do anything, right? That just builds out one of those rooms and puts a label on it, right? That's basically like saying, okay, this is our master bedroom, and we're putting a label of master bedroom on it. We have another one of these that's called main, and that's for the main content of the site. And that's the same sort of thing, right? So if we wanted to build out another room, we could do that here. And that's just like building out another one of these rooms and putting another room name on it. Footer defines the footer for a document. And this is like the bottom part, right? So this is like creating another one of those rooms and putting the room name on it. We can do that as well. Right? So if we put our footer here, we can see on its own, if we run this, right? This doesn't add anything to our site, right? We're just building those divisions. We're putting up those walls, and we're putting a room number on those walls. So we talked about head. We talked about header. Let's talk about headings and paragraphs, and then we'll wrap things up for today. So a heading, not to be confused with the head or the header, is used to define HTML headings, right? Like if you look at, say, a paper, right, an essay, you see different sections have different headings at the top of that section to say, like, oh, what this section is about, right? And then if you have a subsection that's a part of another section, it has a subheading, right? And so that's what we're dealing with here. H1 defines the big topics, and then as we go down to H6, these are smaller topics. These don't just go in order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, in terms of how we put them on there. These are like headings and subheadings, right? So a subheading that goes underneath an H1 is an H2. If we then go to a new topic, we go back to an H1. Right? That's our differences there. We always start at an H1, and then if there's a subheading under the same topic, we go to an H2. If there's another subheading under that same topic, it's another H2. If we go to a subheading under one of those subheadings, then that becomes an H3. So even though we have an option to go up to an H6 here, I rarely, if ever, use anything past like an H3. I don't think I've used anything past an H3 on a regular website ever. Right, so there's that. So if we looked at this in terms of our site that we have here, in the header, I might put an H1. And this H1 would be my topic, right? My main topic, which would be my first website. And then in my main here, I might put some H2s because they would be subtopics about my H1. So maybe about me, right? So this would be an H2, opening H2 with a closing H2, about me. We'll leave some space there. We'll come back and put a paragraph there in a minute. H2 about my friends, right, or whatever. And now we're starting to get text on our website, right? We can see we have our H1's a little bit bigger than our H2's, right? Well, we still want to make sure that we're using everything in order, in the proper order, right? We don't want to use something that's the wrong heading level just because it's the size we want. Because we can always change the size later. When we get to CSS, we'll talk about how we change the size. Now, we can talk about paragraphs here for a minute. And with paragraphs, we use our P tag. There is only one paragraph tag, P. P tag defines a paragraph. Every year, invariably, students try to use P2, P3. Those don't exist. It's just P. And the great thing about using our P tag is that it automatically adds a little bit of space around each of them. So if I wanted to add a little bit of information about me to this site, right, I can go up underneath the About Me here, add an opening P tag, a closing P tag, and between these two tags, I could add a little bit of information about me here. And I'm just going to keep typing as much as I want. Right? If I want to have another paragraph of information under there, I'm going to create another paragraph tag. Here's another paragraph about me. And when we run that, we're going to see there are those paragraphs. And we can see that little bit of space there. I can also add some spacing here for some paragraph tags. Here's some information about my friends. Or whatever, right? And we can just have that information in there. We can also just use a paragraph tag in general for like some copyright information. In this instance, I could just put a paragraph in here in my footer. You can use the and symbol, ampersand, copy, semicolon as all one word. That'll create the copyright symbol. Mr. Ramsey 2022. And that'll just give me my little copyright information there at the bottom. Right. And that'll be some more information there. So that's kind of the basics that we're working with here. Another thing to kind of point out is that I can add some space here. I encourage you all to do this, right? Like this, as you can probably see, is getting a little bit sloppy here because I'm rushing through and I'm kind of, trying to add a lot of code here at the end to try to get some stuff in there so I can send this all out to you and get you all as much information as possible while still keeping this live class at, relatively 1 hour in length. But one of the big things is, with HTML, since it is friendlier, right, and I can make these, all uppercase, all lowercase. I can even just randomly do whatever here, right? It's still going to be friendly and work. It's not going to break it. I want to try to make it as readable as possible so that when I'm actually building and working on it, like I can make sense of what I'm doing and actually know what I'm looking at. And the more that you try to rush and the more that you kind of make a mess of it, the harder that it gets to kind of tell what's going on. And it's when you start to do that you start to make mistakes. So like the spacing doesn't matter. The tabbing doesn't matter. But it does make things a whole lot easier to read. And it makes mistakes a whole lot easier to catch. Right? Like you notice there that when I made those changes there, those formatting changes, it didn't change the way my output looked over here one little bit. But my code is a whole lot nicer to read over here now. Right? I can look at it more quickly and easily and just see what's going on a lot better. And so that's all that I have for you for today. We'll go ahead and wrap it up here. We're basically at exactly the 1 hour mark here. We'll turn the music back on for just a couple minutes here. We'll take any questions that anybody who's here with me live might have. I might put out another supplementary video maybe tomorrow just to kind of go along with this for you all, just to kind of help back you up with all of this, just because it is a lot of information in a short amount of time. But that's all that I have for you for today. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.